Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Thursday, March 13th, 2025, and on Thursdays we look into knowledge and science. Before we get started today, though, I want to extend a happy birthday to Ashley, but also to Kaylee, and Mariola, among many others, of course. So, vaccines. I want to talk about vaccination today. One of the greatest discoveries of modern medicine, capable of defeating virtually any disease, at least in principle. Perhaps the most famous is the smallpox vaccination. This was the first ever vaccine developed to combat a contagious disease. And smallpox was just a horrible, often lethal disease, killing perhaps as many as 20 to 60% of adults and an even greater percentage of children, infected children, of course. The history of smallpox vaccination starts really with back in 1796 with the English physician, Edward Jenner, who discovered the vaccine. The remarkable efficacy of the vaccine led fairly quickly to efforts to start vaccination programs in many countries in the first half of the 19th century. Progress was relatively slow for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the inability to produce large quantities of the vaccine efficiently. Plus, we're talking about the earliest stages of vaccine development and biomedical knowledge, and a lack of widespread information or standardized medical practices in this regard as well. But perhaps most importantly, this was still the earliest stages of industrialization and a world that was far more disconnected than the world we live in today. So sharing information, developing programs, best practices, the technologies and best practices within medicine, a lot of this had yet to be developed, at least with respect to the smallpox vaccine. So it wasn't until 1959, remarkably, that the World Health Organization, or WHO, formulated a global plan to eradicate smallpox. Unfortunately, their campaign suffered from a lack of funding, personnel, regular outbreaks across South America, Africa, and Asia, and the fact that even though there were commitments by several of the countries, there were tremendous vaccine shortages that still persisted. So, this led to an intensified eradication program that began in 1967 with the promise of renewed efforts, and many countries now had labs that could produce both more vaccines and higher quality vaccines, along with additional technological advances, integrated case surveillance, and then mass vaccination campaigns. So that led to ultimately the eradication of smallpox entirely by 1979. And so, unfortunately, by that time, the disease in the 20th century alone had already killed an estimated 300 to 500 million peoples just in the 20th century. So, scientific research and the field of immunology then have only accelerated in the years and decades since that time, to the point where we understand quite well the spread of infectious diseases and the underlying mechanisms associated with the vast array of potentially lethal diseases that humans are prone to encounter. And of course, we live in a dynamic, ever-changing world where there are always new diseases emerging, and in that sense, we always have to be vigilant. But in light of our tremendous medical advances and the obvious benefits to eradicating deadly diseases, if possible, why are there still so many people then, and a growing number for that matter, who are what we would describe these days as anti-vaxxers? Well, first, who am I talking about? And more importantly, let's describe the nature of the issue and what we know about people's views on vaccines in general, okay? So what are the attitudes of the general population? Well, what I'd like to do is talk about the levels and the degree to which the public supports vaccines or opposes them. As best we can determine, the clear majority of folks still are quite supportive of vaccines, but especially based on population surveys across Canada's like the United States, Canada, and the UK. So in one study, more than 13,000 folks were surveyed from across these three countries, and they were asked several Likert scale attitudinal questions about their support for vaccines. So again, sort of along the lines of, do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with the following? And so, in particular, they developed something called the Parental Perspectives Regarding Vaccines scale. And the scale consisted of several items. Again, people were asked to express their levels of agreement or support with each of the following. Getting vaccines is a good way to protect children from disease. Generally, I do what my doctor recommends about vaccines. New vaccines are recommended only if they are safe. I am concerned about serious side effects of vaccines. Some vaccines cause autism in healthy children. Parents should have the right to refuse vaccines required for schools for any reason. So, and then finally, vaccinations are one of the most significant achievements in improving public health. Okay, so based then on the surveys of these samples, again, in each country there's over 4,000 individuals who were studied, and their results, which are again analyzed statistically, and there's a variety of different interesting techniques to do that. But what they determined was that there were four general categories of respondents. First are the strong supporters. Again, strongly believe in the safety and the effectiveness of vaccines. Sometimes, though, they might still express concerns about possible side effects. The supporters with concerns are highly confident that the vaccines are important as a public health tool, but they aren't quite as keen to try the new vaccines, and they express greater concerns about possible safety issues or effects, but they're still considered to be supporters. Then you have the vaccine hesitant group. They have very modest support regarding the importance of vaccines and following doctor recommendations, and they're especially concerned about the side effects. They support parents' rights to refuse vaccines, and there's a greater likelihood that they believe that vaccines cause autism. And then the strongest opposition are the anti-vaxxers. They're highly skeptical of vaccines on all fronts, strongly support parents' rights to refuse vaccinations, and so on. Okay, so how does this break down then by country? Well, I've prepared a little chart there based on the data. And actually, let me change the view here so you can see it a little bit better. That's not it. That's the view. Okay, so again, you have the three countries. The USA are in blue, Canada in orange, the UK in green. And you see the percentages of each supporters with concerns, the hesitant, and the anti-vaxxers. So again, this is based on the research done, or the surveys conducted in 2022. So what you see then is the strongest support in general in the UK, followed by Canada, and then the lowest overall levels of either strong supporters or support with concerns in the United States. And then, of course, correspondingly, what we see then is that you have more people who are hesitant. In the US, that's about 25%, as well as about 8% who are anti-vaxxers, actually just over 8%. Yeah, just around 8%. So bottom line is about 1 in 3 people in the US are either hesitant or outright anti-vaxxers. So the highest level of skepticism exists within the US, at least compared to Canada and the UK. Again, in Canada, we see that about 45% are supporters and 31% are supporters with concerns. So again, you're talking in the order of three quarters of the population. Even higher percentage in the UK, where you've got basically 5 and 6 people who are supporters or supporters with concerns. And then again, correspondingly, you have fewer people who are hesitant in Canada in the UK than the US. But interestingly, almost the same number or percentage of anti-vaxxers in Canada and the US, that 7.5 to 8% category. Okay, so that's just a very simplistic description that I found in the research, or in this particular, summarized in this particular study. And then in terms of why people may or may not support vaccines, it gets quite interesting here as well. So there are, of course, many individual reasons. And by that, I mean that most people obviously still support the idea of getting vaccinated and having their children vaccinated. But there can be any number of personal reasons based on one's own experiences, anecdotes, what they've heard from other friends, and so forth. So what I just want to briefly do from the research is summarize what are some of the social correlates, first of all. And they're fairly consistent across the 3 countries here that we're talking about. The strongest support consistently can be found amongst those who are more highly educated, meaning that those with, measured in this case by those with college and university degrees. We also find greater support, interestingly, amongst people who are older. But at the same time, those who self-identify as more liberal in their political orientations, and those who belong to the more liberal or left-wing parties in each of the respective countries. Conversely, the strongest opposition, the anti-vaxxers, tend to be amongst those who are less educated, who are very conservative or right-wing in their political orientations and party membership. And age drops out as a significant predictor, sort of all over the map with respect to age and its correlation with being anti-vax. I should mention, too, that in the U.S., African Americans are also more likely to be anti-vax compared to other ethno-racial groups. And not surprisingly, the majorities of those who fell into the vaccine hesitant or anti-vax categories thought that the COVID-19 vaccines were not especially safe. And more than 3 of those who were strongly or moderately supportive of vaccines thought, of course, that the COVID-19 vaccines were indeed safe. So a real dichotomy or polarization in that regard. Now, obviously, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, which may or may not be considered rational or reasonable depending upon your information, what you consider to be compelling evidence. Most people, of course, are not altogether familiar with how research gets conducted, or they haven't spent time in research laboratories, and they are simply unaware of the extent to which vaccine approvals have to meet these incredibly rigorous standards before governments are going to approve of their distribution and usage. At the same time, to be fair, we also have to be aware, and we are indeed well aware, of the potential risks and side effects that can be involved. But if you really want to become expert in that regard, you'll have to do a much deeper dive into the full range of evidence before you can arrive at any types of reasonable conclusions. And that's why most of us still have to rely on the scientific community and the experts on the front lines conducting the research. And even better are the studies that are published by those independent scientists who have no stake in the production of the vaccines, or the industry interests, or those who fund their industry or fund their companies in any way, shape, or form. Basically, as long as they don't have any financial incentive or backing of those who produce vaccines, or, well, regardless of their perspective, as long as they're not working on behalf of an organization that's either, promoting or support, or who are anti-vax in nature, then you can be a little bit more confident in terms of the nature of their research. Again, we're talking about if you can find research and researchers who are conducting independent studies where they have no skin in the game, so to speak. That's your best option. All right? And I guess in some ways that's probably the key piece of advice that I'd like to share today. That is to say, Doing your own online research is not even remotely comparable to doing actual laboratory research or scientific research in general. And so in that sense, I strongly recommend trusting the most independent and rigorous research studies, scientific research that you can find, okay? Especially look at the meta-analytic reviews that summarize vast reams of research, or vast swaths of the actual independent published studies, and what are the overall conclusions that can be reached, however tentative they might be. All right? But most folks, of course, in the general public, and those who say, yeah, I did my own research, well, the problem is that for the most part, they don't approach the research and the information that they're trying to find online in an objective and an unbiased way. Instead, most people tend to engage in, I've talked a little bit about this before, in both selection bias and confirmation bias. That is, they want to only look for the studies that support their preconceived notions and confirm their beliefs. And that's not the same thing as being a, rigorous, independent researcher who just wants to get at the truth. Looking at all of the evidence, looking at the quality of the evidence, looking at the methodologies, and then trying to arrive at an empirically informed decision with respect to whether it be vaccines or almost any other scientific question one might have. And so that leads to my final point then. The tendency to rely upon social media platforms in this fast-paced and interconnected digital era in which we live. So whether it's breaking news or scientific discoveries, whether we're talking about cultural phenomena or political developments, we often have to rely, or many people, most people these days, rely on various social media outlets. These are the dominant conduits through which information reaches the widest audiences possible, and in many instances instantaneously. So of course that's the era that we live in. And most importantly, the vast majority of this information is largely unvetted. In other words, anyone can post almost anything without regard to oversight, verification, replication, credibility, credentials of those conducting the research, and so on. In other words, any bozo, including yours truly, can start a vlog series or post whatever they like regularly online, saying just about anything. And social media platforms, then, we know this quite convincingly from the evidence, have emerged as powerful tools that play a significant role in facilitating communication and widespread dissemination of information. At the same time, though, misleading information and full-blown conspiracy theories can be shared just as readily. So this has a major impact then, globally, on public perceptions, especially on things like the effectiveness of vaccines, perhaps more in the United States than just anywhere else. Okay, and so what's happened is we've witnessed then especially with the attack on science and the attack on public institutions in general, we've seen a marked decline in trust in science and in the scientific community. And so, unfortunately, this means then that there's a lot of information or misinformation and disinformation that can get spread online. Does it matter? Does this have any effect? Well, another study, actually looked at a global evaluation of social media usage and online foreign disinformation campaigns to examine possible effects on vaccination rates and attitudes towards vaccine safety. So in this case, the researchers used a large N cross-country analytic framework to evaluate the possible effects of social media on vaccine hesitancy globally. Okay? And they studied social media usage amongst the general public and the level of negatively oriented discourses regarding vaccines. So, for example, based on all of the geocoded tweets over a 2-year period. This is how they were able to study what was being disseminated. And so they then also looked at the polls and what proportions of the public in each of 137 countries felt that vaccines are unsafe, and then looked at the annual data with respect to vaccination rates. And so what they found is that indeed social media usage, or I should say the use of social media to organize offline actions, were highly predictive of the fact that, or the spread of this belief that vaccinations are unsafe. And these beliefs only grew as the organization of the social media campaigns grew. And indeed, they also found that the prevalence of foreign disinformation was highly statistically and substantively significant in predicting the average drop in vaccination coverage over time. And finally, they also found support for the connection between foreign disinformation with negative social media activity with respect to vaccination, all of which led to a significant rise as well in anti-vax tweets by the order of 10 to 15%. So in short, there's a significant relationship between the organization on social media and public doubts about vaccine safety. In addition, there's a significant relationship between foreign disinformation campaigns and declining vaccination coverage. And therein lies, I think, an especially compelling challenge to our overall scientific literacy and genuine knowledge. That is to say, there are bad actors out there. And there are bad actors in a variety of different spheres, not just foreign influences or foreign agents who, have an interest in harming other populations. But there are bad actors in multiple different spheres who can flood the zone on social media and disseminate all sorts of bad, distorted, misleading information. Okay? And that, of course, is going to further impact the public policies or the discourse that we have, and then ultimately the public policies and even people's behavioral proclivities, whether to get vaccinated or not, for example. So, obviously you're never going to get 100% agreement or a consensus or shared understanding of any issue or problem. But I'd still think it'd be nice, especially in the case of vaccines, to at least come close to, hit, or even surpass, say, the 90% mark. It's in our shared interest, quite frankly, if we can get there. Okay, so that's it for today. Until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And maybe get vaccinated if you think it might help. But if you have any doubts in that regard, be sure to look up the most rigorous and objective research possible. Again, I'm not saying that every vaccine is entirely safe, that you are protected from any possible risks. I wouldn't say that about anything. But at the very least, I wouldn't spread, or at least myself, I have no interest, I have nothing to be gained. I'm not involved in vaccine research and anything along those lines. So I'm going to try to share in this vlog and with every vlog the best information that we have currently available, okay? And that I have available. And then when I learn new information, or if the research moves us in a different direction, I'll be sure to share that as well. Okay, so again, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts, and give someone a hug. All right, take care. Bye-bye.